Thank you very much. We'll go right away to the next fireside chat, and I'm very happy to welcome to the stage Tumi Magbabo, who already you met last night probably, broadcaster and entrepreneur at Africa Worldwide Media, and she's coming with Laman Rutten from KSA Metals Exchange. Please join us here.
Thank you, Remy. A very, very good morning. I hope everybody's feeling energized and wide awake for the second day of the forum. Thank you very much. I'll take a seat. Can I please make sure that Lamont has also got a microphone before I get started? Thank you. I was going to do it for you, but okay. Yeah, you just want to get on the stage. I see you. So, Lamont, our topic of discussion, sorry, I should just introduce you if you'll give me 1 second. So, Lamont, you are the CEO and of the mining business within Ajlan Brothers. Is that correct?
The mining exchange part of the business.
Mining exchange part of the business. So one of the key things when we're talking about innovations and initiatives for supporting the new minerals industry, the reality of the matter, and we spoke a lot about this yesterday, the size of the growth that we're going to see over the next decade or so is quite enormous. It's astronomical, not just in the industry as a whole, but what Saudi Arabia is doing in an effort for itself to meet the demand. What needs to happen to ensure that Saudi Arabia, and indeed the region and the world, is better suited to meet the delivery of that demand?
Well, I think the reality of it is that we need many more companies, both in the upstream part, in the downstream part, and in the services part. It's undoubtedly true that the large companies that have been built up here in Saudi Arabia are very good at what they're doing, but they can't be good at everything. And fact of the matter is that smaller companies are often way better suited for jobs that require a more nimble approach, lower overheads, different type of risk appetite. And if you want to achieve the goal that Saudi Arabia has to really make metals into the third pillar of the economy in a relatively short time, you really need to create room for these smaller companies to come up.
So let's break that down. When we're talking small companies, in the conversation yesterday, we're talking about the big mining companies and the billions that are being spent. But one thing that you pointed out when we had a moment to speak briefly is that there are a lot of industries, or there's a lot of space for service industries within the mining sector, where you can have that smaller business that is more nimble. Some of those spaces are where you think there's opportunity?
Frankly, across the chain. One of the interesting numbers here in Saudi Arabia is that of the value added in mining, only 15% is local content. 85% goes to foreign companies. In Africa, that's 50% overall, broadly. So it's quite remarkable that in Africa, local companies are able to provide much more local content than in Saudi Arabia. It's a big loss for the economy, not necessary in our view, but you need to allow these services companies to come up. And services are relatively straightforward. They often don't require a lot of big investments. They require skills, and there are skilled people in this.
So that's exactly my next question, because when you're talking about needing a small business, which is going to supply into a pretty sophisticated environment, right? So even though you're small, the level of delivery required is pretty high. How do you begin to bridge the gap, not just from a skills perspective, but from a service level perspective within those small businesses to ensure that they can deliver and aren't almost immediately overwhelmed?
Well, the answer, frankly, if again you can find it in Africa, African governments introduced local content policies. The companies that provided that local companies were set up by people who worked for these international companies. So they developed the skills, often decades of experience. They knew at what level of quality to provide. What they didn't have was capital. Now, one interesting fact is that many of the large companies actually recognized that in the long run, it would be better for them to let some of their staff go to create their own services companies. Because again, smaller, more nimble companies are more cost effective. So broadly speaking, and by the way, this is not limited to mining, you have the same in oil and gas. Let me just give you one small statistic. Over the past 10 years, junior miners accounted for 25% of exploration expenditure in Australia. They accounted for 75% of discoveries. Okay, so a buck spent on a smaller company is a buck much better spent in many cases. Not always.
It takes you further.
Cases. Yeah.
So I chuckled just now when you were talking about, they need to let their employees go so that they can go and start these small businesses. I think from an idealistic and an idea perspective, that absolutely sounds great. The reality is that for many organizations, the investment in those resources becomes prohibitive because now you don't want that resource to leave, you want to keep it in the business. How do businesses begin to think differently about that? So you say it should happen. But how does that happen, number one? And what I'd like to get a sense of also is the question of exchanges, because there needs to be a different thinking. If we're not just going to be dealing with organizations at the multi-billion-dollar level, how do exchanges need to be thinking differently about ensuring that their services are better supportive?
Okay, the way that companies look at this, frankly, you need certain services can be provided in-house or outsourced. There are many services that are really not core to the company. And if you try to provide them in-house, when that grows in scale, certain moment the executives start realizing it's no longer efficient. Let those people go. Support them, provide them with venture capital. And again, this has happened in other parts of the world. It is not charity to help your staff create their own companies. Those staff will turn around and provide you with those same services that previously they provided in-house, but now in a better way, higher quality, better cost. Now the thing is that those new companies require a different type of ecosystem than big companies do. One of the Tadawul is the securities exchange here in Saudi Arabia. It's one of the world's 10 largest securities exchanges. So again, very successful. Tadawul has two platforms, the main board and what they call the board for smaller companies. The main board average market cap is $4 billion. The smaller board close to $400 million. Now, those are not small companies, okay, 400 million. There is right now no room for smaller companies to raise public funds here in Saudi Arabia. At the same time, as we've heard yesterday, there are many, many Saudi investors who are now going abroad with their money. There are millions of Saudis who invest in global commodity markets. They can't invest here in Saudi Arabia. So what you need is an exchange that allows these smaller companies to list in the same way as smaller mining companies can now list in South Africa, in Canada, in Australia. Impossible on Tadawul. So you need a venture type exchange. And then you need to interest those large number of Saudi investors who are now putting their money abroad in that local sector, get Saudi money into these local companies.
So granted, when you're talking 400 million, they're not tiny, they're not micro enterprises, but the reality is that there's, in many environments, there's a particular a branch where you can't readily access finance, but you're not a bootstrap startup, right? So you're quite big, you're doing several million, whatever a year, but you're not quite readily able to access the funding that's going to allow you to push closer to the 400 million. You can't access it readily, but you're not small enough for a bootstrap kind of situation. What is the discussion that needs to happen for that band of business? Because I think even if you're talking at 400 billion, it's that band that's going to be million, it's that band that's going to support the 400 million, right?
Yeah. It is that middle terrain from, you can, not everyone, but many people are able to raise a few $1 million from friends and family. Okay? To go from a few million to the 20 million, 50 million, that you need to then hit that next level, that's where it really gets difficult. That is no longer private money that you can just get by going around and shaking hands. That's when you start needing a public market. And again, these public markets exist in other countries. There are investors who like that type of risk, and it's critical to create that next generation
Exactly.
of mid-sized companies. Because really public money is the only money that can help them get there.
We're almost going to be out of time in just a few minutes, so I'm not going to drag it out too much longer. When you are looking at an almost to-do list, right, for Saudi Arabia, because we're specifically focusing on the support required in this environment, what does that to-do list look like? So we need to start here and do ABC. Can you take us through what your to-do list would look like for those companies and for those organizations within Saudi Arabia to ensure that that support is in fact evolving?
Well, there's a lot of education. Business needs to be done differently by the companies as well as by investors and the financial intermediaries. For companies, it's a challenge to become listed. If you were used to not report to anyone, and now you have to report in a preset format, I mean, that's a big psychological block. So people do need a lot of thinking around that. For investors, it requires, if you want, a more long-term view on investments, portfolio thinking. It's a big educational process. For the regulators who are supposed to determine what instruments can be offered to investors, it requires also a completely different way of thinking.
Yeah.
You know, Ma'aden is a relatively straightforward story. You've got a nice annual report, the numbers are clear, they've been doing this for many years. A company that has just discovered so many tons of gold in the desert, you know, how does the regulator look at the way that company discloses its information? So the regulator also has to learn. So frankly, the biggest challenge that we face in getting this initiative going is education.
During the discussion yesterday, when you're speaking about education, one of the conversations was about learning institutions and how they can better support the skills drive that's going to be required to do this project. And what was interesting in that conversation was the sense that there isn't a good enough coordination between absorbing industries and the producing learning institutions. Mm-hmm. How much better do they need to do, not just in terms of coordinating, but in terms of trying to fine-tune the skills, number one, and making sure that the spectrum is broad enough that you're not just feeding one aspect of the industry, because it is so large and it does require so many supportive elements.
No, I completely agree. Fact of the matter is that this whole industry is moving fast. Technology is advancing, and many university professors were not trained in these times. So many people in the industry are more advanced in their understanding of technologies, methodologies than university people are. And you need much more debate on those issues where, as an industry, we can't just be asking for it. We will have to work more closely with the industry. We have to start developing joint programs, not just complaining about the lack of graduates who have the appropriate training.
Anybody listening to this conversation, it's quite clear that there's a lot to do. Is it doable in such a short period of time? And don't say, you can't say, we have to do it. The reality is that what we want to do and what we can actually do aren't always the same thing.
Well, frankly, at the end of the day, there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The economic financial potential of this sector is enormous. People have made fortunes in similar environments in the past. You do need to do certain things to actually realize that potential. So I think, frankly, that the smell of that pot of gold will get people to orient their noses in the same directions. So I do believe that the mere fact that there is such a large potential in this sector will help overcome all the normal constraints. People will move fast if there is this pot of gold waiting for them.
I'm looking forward to seeing it happen. I'm looking forward to you being a part of making it happen. So it's certainly exciting, interesting, and quite daunting for many. So Lamont, thank you so very much. Our 10 minutes and a little bit is now up.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
And thank you for
all.
your attention.